While the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at least appears on this day to be ratcheting down, the tensions in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran are once again soaring. You're looking at social media video, Saudi defense forces shooting down a missile over Riyadh, the Saudi capital. Rebel forces in Yemen, backed by Iran, took credit for this missile and said they were hoping it would land on a palace where the Saudi king was having a meeting.
This is now the third missile the Iranian-backed Houthi rebel groups have fired from Yemen at Saudi Arabia, and there are fears the attack will escalate the proxy war Saudi Arabia and Iran are fighting in Yemen. The war has already created a humanitarian catastrophe in the country, the poorest in the Middle East. To discuss further on all of that, let's bring in Craig Snyder. He's the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Craig, the Saudis are already pummeling Yemen. With this missile attack, how bad is it going to get for people in that country?
Well, it's hard to imagine that it can get much worse, but I suppose it always can. You have a large-scale famine. You have a terrible cholera epidemic. These are kind of biblical plagues that are being visited there, and they're man-made because of the war that's ongoing there. Saudi policy doesn't seem really concerned at all with the human rights situation in the area, in Yemen. And so I think it actually can continue to get worse.
Craig, for the Houthi rebels who are backed by Iran, what's in it for them to take credit for a missile that was unsuccessful?
Well, they want to show that they still have fight in them, that despite a very, very large, very long-term at this point, and very sort of unbridled air campaign that the Saudis have been waging, that they're still in the game and indeed deploying new tools, new weapons to show their persistence. It has never been entirely clear from a publicly available information point of view exactly the extent of the Iranian involvement, the degree of Iranian control. So it's hard to say whether or not this is truly sort of a part of the rebel movement within Yemen or whether this is directed from Tehran.
Well, either way, let's say another rocket comes into Saudi Arabia and actually hits the intended target and people die, then this proxy war in Yemen will turn into a real war in Saudi Arabia. What role will the U.S. play then?
Well, the United States so far has been sort of de facto on the side of the Saudis. Remember that the Saudis are using U.S.-supplied, U.S.-sold weapons and munitions. So the destruction that's being reaped in Yemen by the Saudis is with American equipment. And we've certainly at least acquiesced in that going on because the administration has a view that that Saudi Arabia is a strategic ally, despite a lot of difficulties, whereas Iran is a strategic peril. I don't see that view changing.
Does any of this change the status of Iran in the eyes of the United Nations in that we just saw, for example, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, arguing that this was the last missile that was fired was from Iran, and therefore Iran is violating UN sanctions. If now there's yet another missile that's been fired, and this one also ends up being from Iran, doesn't that strengthen the UN case and strengthen Trump administration's case against Iran?
Well, I suppose it does in terms of evidence, but this is the UN is hardly a courtroom, hardly impartial, hardly apolitical. It's all sort of the court of public opinion, the court of political opinion in the world. So yes, it's bad evidence of Iranian ill will in the area, Iranian participation in violence in the area, but we already know that. The question is, does the UN do anything significantly different about it? And that's doubtful.
Craig, last question. How do you see this ending?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball that showed some hope for the suffering people of Yemen. I think that's where the focus needs to be, is on this, not as a geopolitical crisis, as a proxy war, as we've said, but really as a humanitarian crisis. That, it seems to me, needs to be the focus, and it has not been the focus so far among the powers of the world. I hope that can change. If the world learned anything from the 20th century, it ought to be that these kinds of crimes against humanity, however they're committed and whoever they're committed by, should be intolerable in the 21st century.
Yeah, you think the world would learn, but somehow they don't. All right, Craig Snyder, thank you again for coming on our show, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. We keep saying this.